Hello and welcome to Freedom News, the news you can use to help keep Canada free.
Today is yet another dark day for farmers in Canada, particularly those affected by this government's incompetence in dealing with the Chinese. The Conservatives wanted to ask for an emergency debate on the issue regarding the Canola Crisis, and well, this is how that went.
Carried.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic Clérable is rising on point of order. Mr. Speaker, for the second time in the 2 days, we have not gotten to the topic of requesting emergency debates. The canola producers of Canada are counting on Parliament to talk about the crisis and for us to have an opportunity to talk about the real issues that affect canola producers in this country. Mr. Speaker,
that this crisis must be a top priority and cannot be put off any longer. That's why I request the unanimous consent to go back to the request of emergency debate right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Does the Honourable Member for Mégantic-Clérable have the unanimous consent of the House? No, there is no unanimous consent.
Now, you may be asking yourselves, how in the world do we get here? Well, there was a motion. Let's see this motion.
And sustainable development.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 36, Bracket 8, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's response to 6 petitions. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I would move, second by the member from Waterloo, that the House do now proceed to orders of the day.
Well. Mr. Lamoureux, seconded by Ms. Chager, moved that the House do now proceed to the orders of the day. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Yay! All those opposed will please say nay. In my opinion, the nays have it. Call on the members.
And then, of course, they proceeded to call in the members to actually have the proper vote. And this is how that went.
Order. Alors, the question is the following one. Mr. Lamoureux, seconded by Ms. Chager, moved that the House do now proceed to the orders of the day. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Hare. Ms. Wilson-Raybould. Mr. Sajjan. Madame Joly. Monsieur Rodriguez. Ms. Petitpas-Taylor. Ms. Murray. Ms. Chager. Ms. Qualtrough. Mr. Morneau. Ms. Freeland. Monsieur Lametti. Ms. Bennett. Mr. Baines. Ms. Haidu. Mr. Hussain. Mr. O'Regan. Mr. Blair. Ms. Tassi. Ms. Ing. Mrs. Jordan. Ms. Mahaichuk. Mr. Easter. Mr. McKay. Mr. Knoll. Mrs. Lockhart. Monsieur Lauzon, Jean Le Petite Nation. Monsieur Cormier. Mrs. McCrimmon. Mr. Algabra. Mr. Carr. Mr. Sohi. Mr. Holland. Mr. Champagne. Ms. Monsef. Monsieur Garneau. Ms. Duncan Tobeco-North. Ms. McKenna. Madame de Boutillier. Madame Bibeau. Mr. Wilkinson. Mr. Cosner. Mr. Casey Charlottetown. Mr. Vaughan. Monsieur Serry. Monsieur Miller-Ville-Marie du Sud-Ouest et des Serres. Mr. Schiffke. Ms. Gros. Mr. Eiking. Mr. Bagnall. Monsieur Paradis. Mr. Scarpellegia. Mr. Ananda Sangari. Monsieur Marcia Avignon-Lamétis Matapédia. Ms. Goldsmith-Jones. Ms. Demoff. Monsieur Lefebvre. Mr. Mendicino. Mr. Duguid. Mr. Lamoureux. Mr. Beach. Mr. Lightbound. Ms. O'Connell. Ms. Cara. Mr. Varani. Mr. Fraser Central Nova. Ms. Young. Mrs. Shaw. Monsieur Vandal. Monsieur Poisson. Mr. De Courcy. Mrs. Romanado. Monsieur Hébert. Mr. Sims. Ms. Rutanzi. Mr. Dhaliwal. Mr. Pesky-Salido. Madame Mendez. Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Aldag. Mr. Amos. Mr. Arsenault. Mr. Aria. Mr. Ayoub. Mr. Badaway. Madame Lapointe. Mr. Biddle. Mr. Bayliss. Mr. Boissonneau. Mr. Bossio. Mr. Bertina. Mr. Breton. Mr. Chen. Mr. Bruson. Mr. Drouin. Ms. Zerwitz. Mr. Assassi. Mr. El Khoury. Mr. Ellis. Mr. Erskine-Smith. Mr. Fergus. Mr. Finnegan. Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fonseca. Mr. Fragascados. Mr. Fraser Westnova. Mr. Fleur. Mr. Garrettson. Mr. Graham. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Housefather. Mr. Yakono. Mr. Johari. Ms. Khalid. Mr. Levitt. Mr. Long. Mr. Longfield. Ms. Ludwig. Mr. Maloney. Mr. May Cambridge. Mr. McDonald. Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam. Mr. McLeod Northwest Territories. Mr. Morrissey. Madame Nassif. Mr. Oliver. Mr. Peterson. Mr. Picard. Mr. Rioux. Mr. Robillard. Ms. Rudd. Mr. Rumi. Mr. Rusnak. Ms. Sahota. Mr. Saini. Mr. Sanson. Mr. Sangha. Mr. Sarai. Mr. Sheehan. Mr. Sidiou Mission Masquerade Fraser Canyon. Mr. Sekan. Mr. Sorbera. Mr. Spengeman. Mr. Tabera. Mr. Tan. Ms. Vandenbelt. Mr. Whalen. Mrs. Zaid. Madame Fortier. Madame Lambropoulos. Mr. Hogue. Mr. Rogers. Ms. Yep. Mr. Rota. Madame Bendayan. Mrs. Caesar Chavan. Mr. Kong.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Bergen. Mr. Allison. Mr. Bazan. Mr. McColman. Mr. Kent. Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Reyes. Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Deltel. Mr. Fass. Back to Mrs. Block. Ms. Rampol. Mr. Blaney Bellechasse, Les Chemins Lévis. Mrs. McLeod Kamloops Thompson Caribou. Mr. Nuttall. Mr. Doherty. Mr. Barlow. Mr. Berthold. Mr. Martel. Mr. Paulus. Mr. Albus. Mr. Richard. Mr. Workington. Mr. Strahl. Ms. Harder. Mrs. Vecchio. Mrs. Wong. Mr. Abultaif. Mrs. Kuzi. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Lobb. Mr. Sorensen. Mr. Godin. Mr. Clark. Mr. Reed. Mr. Lukiski. Mrs. Wagenthal. Mr. Nader. Mr. Broussard. Mr. Sweet. Mr. Anderson. Mr. Jenner. Ms. Alislav. Madame Boucher. Mr. Carey. Mr. Hobach. Mr. Falk-Provencher. Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Kimmich. Mr. Yerdega. Mr. Janis. Mrs. Gallant. Mr. Dreeshen. Mrs. Falk-Battleford Sloan-Minster. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Albrecht. Mr. Arnold. Mr. Généreux. Mr. Gould. Mr. Kitchen. Mr. Waugh. Mr. Schmale. Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West. Mr. Tilson. Mr. McKenzie. Mr. Shields. Mr. Diot. Ms. Leach. Mr. Leipert. Mr. Vierson. Mr. Motz. Mr. Benson. Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Sopak. Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Shipley. Mr. Miller Bruce Gray Owensound. Mr. Trost. Mr. Julian. Mr. Massey Windsor West. Mr. Bouleris. Ms. Kwan. Mr. Angus. Mr. Caron. Mr. Garrison. Madame Brosseau. Madame Trudel. Madame Sans Souci. Ms. Blaney North Island Powell River. Ms. Jolibois. Monsieur Dussault. Monsieur Aubin. Mr. Nantel. Mr. Choquette. Mr. Blakey. Mr. Cannings. Mr. Johns. Mr. McGregor. Mr. Stetsky. Madame Quash. Madame Laverdière. Ms. Duncan Edmonton Strathcona. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Matheson. Madame Hughes. Monsieur Beaulieu. Monsieur Plamondon. Monsieur Sainte-Marie. Monsieur Thériault. Monsieur Fortin. Madame Gill. Monsieur Barsalou-Duval.
Yeas pour 158, 158. Nays contre 115, 115.
I declare the motion.
In case you are wondering, the MPs that voted yes were voting to skip over the ability for the Conservatives to bring forward the request to have an emergency debate on the Canola Crisis. So if you just saw your MP vote yes, please call them and tell them that our farmers deserve better than this, that they most definitely deserve to have this properly discussed and resolved in Parliament.
Well, that's all I have for today. Like if you like, share, comment, and of course, subscribe. And remember, working together, we can help keep Canada free. Thank you, and have a good day.